Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a vibrant, digitally interconnected country. Huge. Then, almost in a blink, its entire online presence, its national digital identity, it just starts to unravel, going dark within hours. Sounds like something out of a geopolitical thriller. Right. But it's a very real vulnerability. Today, we're diving deep into that very possibility, that chilling scenario. We're guided by this really thought-provoking article titled Disconnecting a Country in 48 Hours: The Risks of Not Having Digital Sovereignty, written by Eduardo Moreno. And this piece, it really makes you confront the hidden fragilities of our hyper-connected world.
Yeah, it's compelling. What's truly compelling about Moreno's work here is that he dissects this not as like mere science fiction, but as an extreme yet technically plausible geopolitical weapon.
Right.
And we're not talking about physically cutting fiber optic cables under the sea or anything like that.
No.
Instead, it's about manipulating the internet's fundamental phone book, the domain name system, or DNS. Moreno explores how removing just a single entry from that global directory could effectively digitally black hole an entire nation.
Wow. So our mission today, then, is to peel back those layers. We need to understand the cascading technical failures that would happen, grasp the, frankly, devastating national impacts on everything from essential banking to government services, and see how this hypothetical scenario throws concepts like digital sovereignty into really stark relief. We'll even contrast Brazil's unique vulnerabilities, as Moreno lays out, with how nations like Russia and China have, well, proactively fortified themselves against just this kind of disconnection.
Exactly. It's a fascinating comparison.
So get ready to reconsider the invisible backbone that underpins, well, everything we do online.
Okay, so to really understand how a country could effectively just vanish from the internet map, we first need to focus on that core naming system, the domain name system, the DNS. Its global hierarchy is the foundation. It starts from the silent root, the single dot you never type. Then it branches out to top-level domains, TLDs like .com or .org. And crucially for this discussion, country code TLDs, or ccTLDs, like .br for Brazil.
Okay.
Entities like IANA, which is part of ICANN, coordinate this huge distributed global system.
And for Brazil specifically, that .br domain, it isn't just some abstract entry floating around, is it?
Not at all. It's managed nationally by a body called CGI.br through its operational arm, NIC.br. Its delegation, its authority, is enshrined directly in the Internet's root zone file.
So it's a foundational piece of Brazil's digital identity on the global stage.
Absolutely fundamental. And this is where policy becomes really critical. Moreno highlights ICANN's longstanding commitment to a single global root. It's a principle established way back in 1999, ICP3, I think it was called. It emphasizes neutrality and universality, the internet for everyone, basically. What's fascinating here, and Moreno really digs into this, is ICANN's historical reluctance to weaponize the DNS, even under immense political pressure sometimes.
Like when?
Well, think about the careful years-long transition of the former Yugoslavia's .u domain. That took ages because they wanted to do it right, neutrally.
Oh.
Or even more tellingly, remember in 2014 there was a U.S. court case, an attempt to seize Iran's .r, Syria's .s, and North Korea's .key ccTLDs as part of sanctions.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that.
ICANN actively resisted that. They argued successfully that these ccTLDs aren't property to be owned or seized by a government. Moreno stresses that delisting .br would be an unprecedented, a really severe breach of these foundational principles.
Yeah.
It would go against decades of practice.
So given these established norms, .br isn't just an address. It's central to Brazil's entire internet presence.
Yeah.
And to remove it would be direct interference, like a digital naming death for a whole segment of the internet, as you put it. It seems ICANN has drawn a very clear line against doing that sort of thing.
It's an absolute line in the sand for them, historically speaking. Now let's think about the technical cascade. If, hypothetically, that line were crossed, what actually happens?
Yeah, what's the immediate effect?
If the .br delegation were deleted from the DNS root zone, the immediate effect is that any global DNS resolver, the servers your ISP or Google run, when they try to find a .br domain, they'd eventually get back an NX domain response.
NX domain.
Non-existent domain. Basically, the internet's way of saying, sorry, that doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, that sounds like an instant blackout, just lights out for anything .br. But Moreno explains there's actually a critical kind of grace period involved, doesn't he? How does that initial phase play out?
You're absolutely right. It wouldn't be an immediate total blackout for everyone everywhere. That's key. TLD name server records, the NS records in the root zone, they typically have what's called a time to live, or TTL. And for TLDs, it's usually set quite high, often around 48 hours. That's 172,800 seconds.
So what does that TTL mean in practice?
It means DNS resolvers all over the world would hold on to Brazil's .br delegation data in their caches for up to 2 days after it was deleted from the root. So immediately after the removal, some users, depending on their local cache state, might still be able to access Brazilian websites or services.
Ah, okay. So it would start as this patchy, confusing outage.
Exactly. Very confusing. Then it becomes near total, as those caches globally expire one by one. Any new query for a .br domain after that cache expiry would hit the root, get the NX domain, and just fail.
So for about 48 hours, it's this fragmented, weird experience. Some people connect, others can't. Like a failing phone system. What happens when those caches do universally expire? When every single new lookup for a .br domain fails right at the root?
That's when the real blackout begins. Moreno points to Sweden's ABS incident back in 2009 as a sort of technical parallel, though that was an accident, a mistake.
What happened there?
A botched update to the .bs zone file caused nearly 1 million .bs domains to effectively disappear from the internet for a while. There were lingering effects because of caching, just like we discussed. But the key distinction Moreno makes is crucial. The .br scenario he describes is intentional and indefinite. It's not an error to be fixed, which means things like cache flushing, trying to force updates, that becomes useless. Once the 48 hours are up, for all practical purposes, .br is universally gone from the global internet.
Right, indefinite deletion.
And the cascading outages from that point, they'd be devastating, hitting multiple fronts simultaneously. First, web services. Think about it. All 5.4 million .br domain websites, government portals, banks, news sites, universities, business big and small, they become unreachable via their standard URLs.
Could people still get there using the IP address directly?
Mostly no. Even if you knew the IP address, which most people don't, modern web services heavily rely on HTTP host headers and especially SSL/TLS certificates. Those certificates validate against the domain name, .br in this case. If the name doesn't resolve, the connection fails or is flagged as insecure. So IP addresses are not a practical workaround. And things like content delivery networks, CDNs, they'd also be useless for .br domains because the initial DNS lookup to even find the nearest CDN server would fail.
Okay, so web access gone. What else?
Next, email. Critically important. MX record lookups, the records that tell servers where to send email for a domain, they'd fail for any at .br address. This means email sent to Brazil from outside, or even often within Brazil between different .br domains, would bounce back or just vanish into a black hole, undelivered.
Wow, critical communication is just stopping.
Precisely. Then think about authentication and APIs. Government single sign-on systems like accessing tax services, banking APIs that mobile apps use. Countless applications rely on .br endpoints for their core functionality. If the DNS lookup fails, the app fails. They'd all cease to function.
That sounds like chaos.
It gets worse. DNSSEC, which is the security extension for DNS, adds cryptographic validation. That validation would also fail for .br domains because the chain of trust back to the root is broken. This generates additional errors, serve fail errors, further compounding the breakage for resolvers that perform validation. And you have to consider countless other services. Software updates delivered from .br servers, security intelligence feeds, even some financial transaction systems like ATMs or credit card processing points. If they rely on .br DNS for resolving back-end systems or updates, it's a ripple effect.
Okay, the technical picture is pretty stark, but when you look beyond that breakdown, what would this actually mean for everyday Brazilians? How would it fundamentally change their economy, their government, their daily lives?
Moreno paints a truly grim picture here, a multifaceted crisis. For government services, imagine all the .gov.br portals just gone. Everything from filing taxes, accessing public health information, interacting with the judiciary, getting citizen services inaccessible online.
That would cripple state administration.
Completely. It forces a reversion to slow, cumbersome analog methods, paper forms, queues. It severely erodes public trust and the government's ability to function, and Moreno suggests it carries a significant potential for civil unrest.
And the economy.
The financial sector would essentially grind to a halt digitally. Online banking for major institutions like Itaú, Bradesco stopped. E-commerce, unable to process transactions linked to .br domains. ATMs might allow basic cash withdrawals if they have direct, hard-coded IP connections for that function, but anything relying on name resolution for updates, back-end checks, or failovers could fail. Moreno points to the potential for a nationwide cash crunch. maybe even panic withdrawals.
That's huge. What about just basic communication and news?
In communications and media, all the major Brazilian news websites hosted on .br domains would be offline. Now, Moreno points out a crucial nuance here, which is really interesting. Physical internet connectivity isn't cut, right? Just the naming system for Brazil's national identity.
So international sites still work.
Yes. People would heavily shift their reliance to global social media platforms, WhatsApp, Facebook, Google Search, Twitter X. They would still work because they don't depend on .br domains for their core function. But imagine the information vacuum. Without trusted local news sources, without government information portals, misinformation and disinformation would undoubtedly run rampant.
A recipe for confusion and instability.
Absolutely. Which leads to the broader impact on public and economic stability. Public confidence would plummet. Economic output would tank as cloud-based systems like ERPs, logistics platforms, anything reliant on .br infrastructure fails. The chaos creates fertile ground for cybersecurity risks, too. Phishing scams, fraud trying to exploit the widespread confusion. And for citizens, just the inability to do daily tasks. Online banking, reading local news, accessing educational platforms, using telemedicine services. It impacts international travel, business relations. It's profound.
So it's really not just a single website going down. It's a nationwide digital blackout for anything specifically tied to Brazil's national domain space. Moreno emphasizes it's like the country becomes a digital island, but one where even its internal networks are partially impaired because of DNS dependencies.
Precisely. And Moreno does touch on potential national mitigations, though they're limited. Brazil has very strong Internet Exchange Points, IXPs. These could help keep purely domestic traffic flowing locally between networks inside Brazil if the services themselves don't rely on external .br lookups.
Okay, so some internal traffic might survive.
Some might. And NIC.br, Brazil's Network Information Center, is technically very competent. They could theoretically coordinate setting up an emergency alternate route system internally just for buyer. This would allow Brazilian users on domestic networks configured to use this alternate route to still resolve and access local .br sites.
But that sounds like creating a separate Brazilian internet.
It is. It's called Split Horizon DNS. It creates a Brazil-only view of the .br namespace. And critically, it would be an open defiance of ICANN's global authority and the single interoperable route principle. It's a reactive, drastic measure, a last resort that fundamentally alters Brazil's relationship with the global internet.
Okay, so that's the DNS side. But you mentioned physical connectivity isn't cut. What about the IP addresses themselves? Could those be targeted?
That's an important distinction Moreno makes. Removing .br from the DNS doesn't directly affect IP routing. Not initially. Brazil has substantial blocks of IP addresses, both IPv4 and IPv6. These are managed by LAOS, the Latin American and Caribbean Internet Addresses Registry. LAONS is one of the 5 independent regional internet registries, or RIRs.
Okay, so the addresses are managed separately, but this brings up a critical question Moreno asks. What if this scenario escalated?
Right.
What if it moved beyond DNS to complete internet sanctions, directly targeting those IP routes? How different is that threat?
That's a much bigger and arguably harder escalation. In such an extreme scenario, yes, major international internet carriers could theoretically agree to black hole Brazilian IP ranges in their routing tables. Stop forwarding traffic to or from those addresses.
Cutting off international connectivity entirely.
Yes, but Moreno points out this would demand a vast, coordinated effort. Brazil has numerous international links, multiple submarine cables connecting it to the U.S., Europe, Africa. Getting all major carriers globally to simultaneously block traffic would be complex. More importantly, he underscores the strong resistance from the RIRs themselves to politicizing IP addresses. Look at RIP-NCC, the RIR for Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Central Asia. During the Russia-Ukraine conflict, they received calls to revoke IP addresses allocated to Russian entities.
Then what did they do?
They firmly refused. They issued public statements asserting their role is purely technical, apolitical resource management, serving all members neutrally. Moreno strongly suggests LAC and IC would adopt a very similar stance regarding Brazilian IP resources. It's core to their mandate.
Okay, so the RIRs likely wouldn't revoke the addresses themselves. What about RPKI? Resource Public Key Infrastructure. Couldn't that be used to isolate routes if the IP certificates were somehow revoked?
That's a more technical angle, yeah. RPKI allows IP address holders like NIC.br or large ISPs in Brazil to cryptographically certify which networks are authorized to announce their IP prefixes in routing protocols like BGP. If LAC under truly immense, unprecedented duress, were to revoke the RPKI certificates for Brazilian prefixes, the networks worldwide that perform RPKI validation, which is increasingly common, could automatically drop those routes as invalid, effectively isolating them.
So it's technically possible, but sounds extremely unlikely given the RAR stance.
Exactly. It would be an extraordinarily drastic action by LACNIs, fundamentally contrary to their mission. And Moreno contrasts this hypothetical with actual practice. He notes that while the U.S. government has seized specific domain names of sanctioned entities, often targeting .com or .net domains which fall under U.S. registry control.
Right, specific websites.
Yes, specific websites. They haven't severed an entire country's core IP connectivity, or, crucially, entire ccTLDs like .ir or .ir. Often there are humanitarian and information access reasons for this. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, even issues general licenses specifically allowing communication services to operate in sanctioned countries. This indicates a policy against total internet cutoffs.
That context is really important. And Moreno walks us through some other fascinating real-world examples too, doesn't he? Examples that really underscore just how unprecedented this hypothetical.br removal would be.
Absolutely. These precedents are key to understanding why it's such an extreme scenario. Let's recap a few Moreno highlights. First, that U.S. court ruling in 2014 we talked about. The attempt to seize Iran's .arr, Syria's the SSI, and North Korea's .kp failed. The court explicitly backed ICANN's argument. ccTLDs are not property subject to seizure. That reinforced the principle that these national domains are different.
Okay, precedent 1, ccTLDs aren't seizable property.
Precedent 2, OFAC sanctions practice. As we just discussed, the U.S. has targeted specific domains, like Iranian state media sites, but these were typically on .com or .net. When Iran's Press TV lost its .com domain, for instance, it simply migrated fully to presstv.ir, its Iranian ccTLD, and remained fully accessible globally. This clearly shows the practical limits of U.S. jurisdiction over foreign ccTLDs managed by other countries or entities.
Right. The U.S. can seize .com, but not necessarily .rr.
Exactly. Then look at actual war and cutoffs. Syria in 2012-13, Egypt during the Arab Spring in 2011 both experienced multi-day internet blackouts. But those were imposed by their own governments, usually involving shutting down physical infrastructure, ordering ISPs offline, not DNS removal. And crucially, Moreno notes, their ccTLDs, BERT-SC and EG, remained in the global DNS root zone throughout those blackouts. Even in Crimea, after its annexation by Russia, there was IP address reshuffling, infrastructure changes, but no removal of domains from the root.
So even in conflict zones or political upheaval, the ccTLD itself stayed put.
Stayed put. And perhaps the most powerful and recent precedent is the Ukraine versus Russia conflict starting in 2022. The Ukrainian government formally petitioned ICANN, asking them to revoke Russia's .ru, ACLN, the Cyrillic TLD, and the legacy.su, Soviet Union domains.
A direct request in wartime.
A direct public request. And ICANN's CEO at the time, Gurun Marby, firmly refused. Publicly, he cited ICANN's core mission of neutrality, its technical coordination role, and stating explicitly that ICANN lacks the authority to unilaterally disconnect domains based on geopolitical disputes or sanctions. Simultaneously, RIEENCC, the IRR managing Russian IP addresses, also rejected calls from the Ukrainian government to revoke those allocations, citing their own neutrality policy.
Wow, so even in that extreme case, the organizations responsible for DNS root stability and IP allocation held the line on neutrality.
Very firmly. Moreno argues these decisions set an incredibly strong precedent against weaponizing the core internet infrastructure like DNS or IP allocation.
It's striking. If even during a major war, ICANN and the RIRs refused to pull the plug on a nation's TLD or IP space, it really makes you wonder, as Moreno does, how prepared are different countries for this kind of digital Armageddon, however unlikely?
Yeah, and Moreno explores this vulnerability gap by comparing Brazil directly to Russia and China, who have taken very different approaches with their sovereign internet initiatives.
How so?
Well, Russia, for example, enacted its sovereign internet law, the RUNet law, back in 2019. This mandated things like creating a completely internal Russian DNS system capable of operating independently if disconnected from the global root. They've conducted regular tests, apparently, of disconnecting from the global internet, claiming success in 2019 and 2021. They've mirrored the ICANN root zone internally and have deliberately cultivated strong domestic alternatives for key services, vContact instead of Facebook, Yandex instead of Google. So Moreno suggests Russia could likely keep its .ru domains, resolving domestically, even if cut off from the global root. They have a plan B.
Okay, Russia has a backup DNS and local services. What about China?
China is maybe even more insulated in a different way. They operate the infamous Great Firewall, of course, which already filters and controls international traffic heavily. They maintain numerous mirrors of the root servers within China. But more importantly, China has developed immense self-sufficiency in domestic content and services. Think WeChat, Baidu, Alibaba, Weibo. The ccTLD is one of the largest in the world, and China could absolutely operate it entirely internally if disconnected. Moreno even suggests that because so many Chinese users primarily use domestic platforms already, a large portion of the population might barely notice if many foreign sites became inaccessible. They have local equivalents for almost everything.
Right, the firewall already creates a degree of separation.
Exactly. Now contrast that with Brazil. Moreno points out Brazil lacks any equivalent sovereign internet law, or that kind of proactive preparation. Historically, Brazil, through organizations like CGI.br, has been a strong proponent of the global, open, multi-stakeholder model for internet governance. They believe in the single internet. While its technical community, especially NIC.br, is highly competent, they run .br incredibly well and could reactively manage an internal DNS for .br in a crisis, as we discussed. They simply don't have the proactive government-mandated infrastructure or the deep domestic service ecosystem that Russia and especially China have built to mitigate this specific kind of attack.
So the picture Moreno paints is very clear then. Brazil is significantly more vulnerable to this specific DNS root attack. A forced removal of .br would hit Brazil far harder and much more immediately, whereas Russia and China have built these substantial cushions, these internal fallbacks.
That's the core argument, yes.
Yeah.
Different levels of preparedness leading to vastly different potential outcomes.
Okay. We've just taken a really deep dive into what might seem, maybe at first glance, like a far-fetched scenario, a country disappearing online. But as Moreno so skillfully lays out in his article, it's a stark and, frankly, quite immediate reminder of the incredibly delicate balance underlying our digital lives.
It really is. What's truly compelling here, I think, is how Moreno's analysis underscores that the DNS isn't just some technical plumbing. It's far more than that. It's a fundamental pillar of national sovereignty in cyberspace today. That hypothetical 48-hour countdown to digital oblivion, the complete shutdown of government and financial services, the forced shift back to analog communication. Moreno shows these aren't just abstract technical breakdowns. They are clear pathways to real-world chaos and national crisis.
Yeah, it absolutely makes you consider the gravity of using internet infrastructure as a weapon, the nuclear option, as some might call it. And Moreno emphasizes that such an act, especially given ICANN's consistent historical refusal to intervene in geopolitical disputes, would undoubtedly trigger massive global backlash. It would fundamentally erode trust in the entire system of global internet governance.
Precisely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Moreno warns that an action like removing .br could directly accelerate internet fragmentation, the dreaded splinter net.
How so?
Well, other countries, seeing Brazil as this cautionary tale, might then feel compelled to aggressively pursue their own sovereign internet solutions, their own internal DNS, more data localization, stronger firewalls, effectively breaking the single global internet into potentially dozens of national or regional segments that don't fully interoperate. And this raises a really important question Moreno leaves us with. Is maintaining that single interoperable internet actually worth the cost? The cost being keeping its technical coordination insulated from geopolitics, even in times of really extreme tension or conflict.
That's a tough question. Absolutely. The hypothetical severing of Brazil's ccTLD, as Moreno concludes, powerfully illustrates just how crucial that principle of neutrality has been. That the Internet's founders, its stewards like ICANN and the RIRs, they've long understood this delicate balance. And the evidence, as Moreno presents it, suggests that even in times of war and intense sanctions, they have so far steadfastly preserved that principle.
We have.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It means that invisible infrastructure you rely on every single day, just typing a web address, sending an email, is constantly navigating these incredibly complex geopolitical waters. And its continued stability, its universality, hinges on a set of norms and principles that are perhaps surprisingly more fragile than you might think.
Food for thought.
Definitely. A lot to mull over the next time you type in a web address, wouldn't you say?